The Wonka factory stood like a looming monolith in the middle of the gray, drab town, its iron gates twisting into ornate swirls that somehow resembled grinning mouths. Above it, smoke billowed from massive chimneys, the air thick with the faint smell of chocolate. For most, it was the scent of dreams. But for the 5 golden ticket winners and their families, it would become the stench of nightmares. A crowd gathered at the gates, cheering and waving as the chosen few stood nervously. Each child clutched their golden ticket, the shimmering foil glinting under the pale sun. The parents lingered behind them, whispering to one another. "When's he coming out?" asked Augustus Gloop, his cheeks already smeared with chocolate from a candy bar he had shoved into his mouth moments earlier. "Patience, Augustus," scolded his mother, her tone sweet but strained. A faint creak echoed through the air as the gates slowly opened. From the shadows of the factory emerged Willy Wonka. He was tall and slender, his purple velvet coat and top hat impeccable. Yet there was something unsettling about him. His movements were too precise, his smile too wide, his eyes too sharp. "Welcome, my friends," Wonka's voice rang out, cheerful and melodic. "What a wonderful day it is, isn't it?" The children cheered, but their parents exchanged wary glances. "I'm so thrilled to finally meet you," Wonka continued, his gaze sweeping over the group. His eyes lingered just a moment too long on each person, as though he were sizing them up. "You must be Augustus Gloop," he said, tipping his hat to the rotund boy. "And Violet Beauregard, a vision in blue." "Veruca Salt," he said, his grin widening as he addressed the haughty girl who stood with her nose in the air. "And Mike Teavee, our little sharpshooter." Finally, his gaze settled on Charlie Bucket. "And you, young man, you must be Charlie." Charlie nodded, clutching his grandfather's arm tightly. Grandpa Joe frowned, his instincts pricking at something he couldn't quite place. Wonka clapped his hands together. "Well then, shall we begin?" The group entered the factory, the gates closing behind them with a low, metallic clang that echoed unnervingly in the air. Inside the factory was a sensory overload. The walls gleamed with polished metal, the floor a swirling mosaic of colors that seemed to shift and shimmer as they walked. Strange machines whirred and clicked in the distance, their purposes inscrutable. But it wasn't the whimsical paradise they had imagined. The air was heavy, almost stifling, and the light had an odd yellowish hue that cast strange shadows. Every corner seemed too dark, every corridor too long. "This place is amazing," Veruca said, her voice dripping with her usual entitlement. "But it smells funny." Wonka turned to her, his smile unchanging. "That's the scent of progress, my dear. You'll get used to it." As they moved deeper into the factory, Wonka began to hum a tune, the sound eerily cheerful in the oppressive atmosphere. The Oompa-Loompas appeared for the first time, their small forms darting in and out of the shadows, their movements silent and deliberate. "Who are they?" Mike Teavee asked, his voice cracking with curiosity. "My loyal workers," Wonka replied, gesturing to them with a flourish. "The backbone of my operation. They're quite shy, but don't worry, they'll warm up to you." Grandpa Joe squinted at the Oompa-Loompas, his grip tightening on Charlie's arm. "There's something not right about this place," he muttered. Charlie nodded, his stomach twisting with unease. The group entered a grand hallway lined with portraits. Each painting depicted children from previous tours, their faces frozen in ecstatic smiles. "Who are they?" Violet asked, popping her gum as she craned her neck to see. Wonka's expression flickered just for a moment. "Ah, those are the lucky winners from past events. didn't quite make it to the end of the tour, but they were unforgettable nonetheless. What happened to them? Veruca pressed, her brow furrowed. Wonka's smile returned, sharper than before. Accidents, I'm afraid. The factory can be unpredictable. The parents shifted uncomfortably, their unease growing. Finally, Wonka led them to a massive door at the end of the hallway. He turned, his face alight with excitement. Behind this door lies the heart of my factory, he said. A place of wonder and delight, but I must warn you, it's not for the faint of heart. He swung the door open, revealing the chocolate river room. The children gasped as they took in the sprawling landscape of sugary delights, a river of glistening chocolate, candy trees swaying in a faint breeze, and fields of edible grass. But beneath the surface beauty, something felt wrong. The chocolate river bubbled too violently, its surface darker than it should have been. The air smelled faintly metallic, like blood masked by sugar. Go on, Wonka said, gesturing grandly. Explore to your heart's content. The children hesitated for a moment before rushing forward, their initial unease replaced by the allure of candy. Wonka lingered at the edge of the room, watching them with unblinking eyes. This, he murmured to himself, his voice low and almost reverent, is where it begins. The Chocolate River Room was a marvel of engineering and confectionery. The children and their parents roamed the landscape in awe, plucking candy leaves from trees and chewing on blades of sweet grass. The air was thick with the scent of cocoa, sugar, and something faintly sour, a hint of rot lurking beneath the surface. But for Augustus Gloop, nothing mattered except the river. The massive boy knelt at the water's edge, his pudgy hands scooping up fistfuls of liquid chocolate. He shoved them into his mouth, smearing the viscous substance across his face as he let out low moans of delight. Augustus, his mother scolded, waddling toward him. You're embarrassing me. Augustus ignored her, leaning closer to the edge. The chocolate river bubbled violently, splattering his shirt. Careful, Grandpa Joe muttered, his eyes narrowing. That river doesn't look right. Charlie nodded, tugging at his grandfather's sleeve. Should we stop him? Before Joe could respond, Wonka appeared beside them, his grin unsettlingly wide. Oh, don't worry. The chocolate is perfectly safe, as long as you're careful. Augustus, his mother cried again, her voice rising in pitch. Get away from there. Leave me alone, Augustus snapped, his voice muffled by the chocolate still in his mouth. He leaned further over the edge, his feet slipping slightly on the slick ground. The river's bubbling intensified, the sound almost like a growl. Someone should really do something, Violet said, popping her gum as she watched from a distance. But before anyone could move, Augustus lost his balance. With a loud splash, his entire body plunged into the river. Chocolate sprayed into the air as he flailed, his screams muffled by the thick liquid. Help, his mother shrieked, rushing to the edge. Someone help my boy. The group froze in horror as Augustus thrashed in the river, his hands clawing at the surface. The chocolate seemed thicker than water, pulling him down like quicksand. Grab him, his mother screamed, turning to Wonka. Do something! Wonka remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. I'm afraid there's nothing we can do, he said calmly. The current is far too strong. The current, Grandpa Joe barked. This is your factory. Turn it off. Wonka sighed, shaking his head. The river doesn't exactly have an off switch, I'm afraid. Augustus should have listened to the rules. What rules? Charlie asked, his voice trembling. Don't touch the river, Wonka said simply, his smile returning. Augustus's struggles grew weaker as the chocolate dragged him under. His mother leaned over the edge, her hands outstretched. "Augustus, grab my hand," she cried, tears streaming down her face. The boy's head surfaced one last time, his eyes wide with terror, before the river swallowed him completely. The room fell silent except for the bubbling of the chocolate and the muffled sobs of Augustus's mother. "No," she whispered, collapsing to her knees. Wonka clapped his hands, the sound startlingly loud. "Well," he said brightly, "that was unfortunate, but accidents do happen in a place like this." "Accident?" Grandpa Joe snapped. "That boy just drowned in your river." Wonka shrugged, his expression unchanging. "He should have been more careful. Actions have consequences after all." The Oompa-Loompas appeared then, their movements eerily synchronized as they carried a large net to the river's edge. With mechanical efficiency, they began scooping the surface, pulling up chunks of chocolate and the occasional shred of fabric. Charlie turned away, his stomach churning. "This isn't right," he whispered to his grandfather. Joe placed a protective arm around the boy. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low. "This man's not what he seems." "Where are they taking him?" Mrs. Gloop sobbed as the Oompa-Loompas worked. Wonka gestured toward a massive pipe extending from the river. "Don't worry, dear lady. Augustus will be taken to the fudge room. It's a lovely place, really." Mrs. Gloop's sobs grew louder. "You monster," she screamed, lunging at Wonka. In a flash, 2 Oompa-Loompas grabbed her arms, restraining her with surprising strength. Now, Wonka said, his tone soothing. "No need for such hostility. I'll make sure he's taken care of, one way or another." The group watched in stunned silence as the Oompa-Loompas carried Mrs. Gloop away, her screams echoing through the factory. "Shall we continue?" Wonka asked, turning back to the remaining guests with a cheerful smile. Violet stepped forward, her face pale. "Continue after what just happened?" "Of course," Wonka replied, his tone light. "There's still so much to see." He gestured toward a large door on the other side of the room, its handle shaped like a twisted candy cane. Charlie hesitated, glancing at his grandfather. "Do we have to?" Joe shook his head. "No, we're leaving." But as they turned back toward the entrance, they found it sealed shut, the iron doors now bolted with thick chains. Wonka chuckled, his voice low. "Oh, I'm afraid there's no turning back now." The next room was impossibly large, its ceiling vanishing into swirling clouds of pastel colors. Long tables stretched out in neat rows, covered with trays of colorful gum, candies, and bubbling beakers of strange liquids. The air was thick with a cloyingly sweet aroma, almost nauseating in its intensity. "This," Willy Wonka announced with a dramatic sweep of his arm, "is my invention room. Here, I create the treats of the future." The children's eyes widened, but the adults shifted uncomfortably. The machines lining the walls hissed and whirred, their ominous sounds making the room feel more like a laboratory than a candy shop. "Everything in here is cutting edge," Wonka continued, his smile widening. "Unstable, perhaps, but cutting edge." Violet Beauregard stepped forward, her gum snapping loudly as she chewed. "What's so special about this gum?" she asked, gesturing to a nearby tray. Wonka's eyes glinted, and he stepped to the tray, picking up a small, colorful piece of gum. "Ah, this is no ordinary gum, my dear Violet. This is a meal in a stick. Chew it, and you'll experience the sensation of an entire 3-course dinner." 3 courses, Violet's father, an imposing man in a sharp suit, asked skeptically. "That's a bit much for a single piece of gum." Wonka chuckled. "It's more than a bit. It's a marvel. But alas, it's still in the testing phase, not quite ready for human consumption." Violet smirked, her competitive streak flaring. "Sounds like you're just scared it won't work." She snatched the gum from Wonka's hand, popping it into her mouth before anyone could stop her. "Violet, no!" her father shouted, rushing toward her. Wonka stepped in his path, his grin frozen on his face. Now, Mr. Beauregard. Let her be. Some lessons are best learned firsthand." Violet began chewing, her confident smirk growing wider. "Tastes like tomato soup," she said, her voice muffled. "And it's so real. This is amazing." Her father's face twisted in anger. "Wonka, stop this." But the confectioner only stepped back, his hands clasped behind his back as he observed Violet with unnerving interest. "Next is roast beef with baked potatoes," Violet announced, chewing faster. Her face flushed, beads of sweat forming on her forehead. "Violet," Charlie said nervously, "I think you should spit it out." "Why?" she snapped, glaring at him. "It's the best gum I've ever had." Her body began to tremble, her skin taking on a strange bluish hue. She staggered slightly, clutching her stomach. "Dessert," she whispered, her voice strained. "Blueberry pie. It's..." Her words were cut off as her body lurched violently. Her limbs swelled grotesquely, her fingers puffing up like sausages. Her face turned a deep, unnatural blue, and her eyes bulged in their sockets. "Violet," her father screamed, rushing to her side. She let out a guttural cry as her stomach expanded, her once slender frame ballooning into a hideous, spherical shape. Her legs buckled under her growing weight, and she collapsed to the floor, her body continuing to inflate. "Help her," her father begged, grabbing Wonka by the lapels. Wonka didn't flinch, his smile unwavering. "I warned her, didn't I? She chose to ignore the rules." "You sick bastard," Mr. Beauregard roared, throwing a punch. Before his fist could connect, a group of Oompa-Loompas swarmed him, their small hands gripping his arms and legs with surprising strength. He thrashed and shouted, but they dragged him toward the far wall, where a door slid open with a hiss. "No, let me go. Violet needs me," he screamed as he disappeared into the shadows. Violet let out one last pained groan before her swollen body shuddered violently. Her skin stretched to its breaking point, then ruptured with a wet, sickening pop. A spray of dark, viscous liquid splattered across the room, coating the floor and walls in a sticky mess. The remaining guests recoiled, their faces pale with horror. Charlie clung to his grandfather, tears welling in his eyes. "Why is this happening?" he whispered. Grandpa Joe held him tightly, his voice shaking. "Because this man isn't who he says he is." Wonka stepped forward, his pristine coat untouched by the carnage. He knelt beside what remained of Violet, inspecting the mess with clinical detachment. "Such a shame," he murmured. "So much potential wasted by impatience." He turned to the others, his smile returning as though nothing had happened. "Well, we must press on. There's so much more to see." Veruca Salt stepped back, her face twisted in fear. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Wonka's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, but you must, my dear. The tour isn't over, and no one leaves until it is." The door to the next room creaked open, revealing another shadowy corridor. "Shall we?" Wonka asked, his tone sickeningly cheerful. The group hesitated, but the sound of heavy machinery starting up behind them made the choice for them. Reluctantly, they followed Wonka into the darkness, their steps heavy with dread. The next room was colder than the others, the air filled with the metallic clang of machinery. Conveyor belts crisscrossed the vast space, carrying mountains of shiny, polished nuts. At the center of the room stood a massive contraption, a towering machine with long claw-like arms and glowing green eyes that scanned each nut before tossing it into labeled bins. "This," Willy Wonka announced, gesturing grandly, is my nut sorting room. Here, my marvelous machine determines which nuts are good enough for my chocolates and which aren't. The children stared in awe as the machine worked with mechanical precision, its claws plucking nuts from the conveyor belt and tossing them effortlessly into the correct chutes. But what happens to the bad nuts? Veruca asked, her voice sharp and demanding. Wonka's smile twitched. They're sent to the incinerator, of course. Veruca wrinkled her nose. That's barbaric. What if there's a mistake? The machine is never wrong, Wonka replied, his tone clipped. Veruca narrowed her eyes at him before turning to her father. Daddy, I want one of those squirrels. Her father hesitated, glancing nervously at Wonka. Sweetheart, maybe we should wait. No, Veruca snapped, stamping her foot. I want one now. Wonka raised an eyebrow. The squirrels aren't for sale, I'm afraid. They're irreplaceable. Veruca ignored him, striding toward the machine with a huff. The Oompa-Loompas standing nearby stepped back, their wide eyes darting toward Wonka, as if waiting for his command. Veruca, her father called, his voice rising in panic. Get back here. Veruca climbed onto the conveyor belt, her polished shoes clacking against the metal. She approached the clawed arms of the machine, her face alight with determination. I'll show you, she muttered, reaching for one of the squirrels perched near the machinery. The machine froze, its glowing green eyes swiveling to focus on her. The conveyor belt stopped, and the air filled with an ominous hum. Wonka's smile grew wider, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. Oh dear, the machine doesn't like intruders. Daddy, Veruca shouted, her voice shrill. Make it stop. But before her father could respond, the machine's claws snapped toward her, gripping her arms with unyielding force. Let me go, Veruca screamed, thrashing as the machine lifted her off the conveyor belt. The green eyes flickered, scanning her up and down. A low, mechanical voice boomed from the machine. Rotten. The claws swung around, tossing Veruca toward the largest chute. She screamed as she tumbled inside, her cries echoing as she disappeared into the darkness. Veruca, her father shouted, sprinting toward the machine. The claws swung again, this time colliding with a nearby support beam. The machinery above groaned and shifted, heavy gears and chains snapping free. No, Mr. Salt yelled, diving forward in a futile attempt to grab the edge of the chute. The machinery collapsed, a massive cogwheel smashing into him with a sickening crunch. Charlie turned away, burying his face in Grandpa Joe's coat. The old man wrapped a protective arm around him, his own face pale and grim. Why is he doing this? Charlie whispered. Why won't he stop? Grandpa Joe glanced at Wonka, who stood at the edge of the conveyor belt, watching the carnage with a serene smile. Because he's not just mad, Joe said, his voice shaking. He's evil. The Oompa-Loompas appeared once again, swarming the remains of the machine. They carried away the broken pieces of equipment and began cleaning the bloodied floor with eerie efficiency. Quite the mess, Wonka said, clapping his hands together. But no matter, there's still much to see. Violet's father and Veruca's parents were gone now, leaving only Charlie, Grandpa Joe, and Mike TV with his increasingly frazzled mother. I've had enough, Mike's mother snapped, her voice shrill with fear. This is insanity. We're leaving right now. Wonka tilted his head, his smile fading slightly. But the tour isn't over, my dear, and leaving isn't an option. The room's exit loomed ahead, its heavy metal door creaking open. Beyond it, the faint sound of whirring machinery and muffled screams could be heard. Charlie clung to his grandfather's hand, his voice trembling. Grandpa, what do we do? Joe's jaw tightened as he looked at the factory's owner. We stay together, Charlie, no matter what. Wonka turned, his smile returning. Onward then, he said, his voice chipper. The best is yet to come. The group hesitated before following him into the next corridor, their dread mounting with every step. Behind them, the Oompa-Loompas began singing in low, haunting voices, their words echoing through the factory. Greedy and rotten, spoiled and vile, Veruca's fate was sealed with a smile. Lessons are learned, but at what cost? Another life taken, another soul lost. The final corridor stretched out before them, a long, dimly lit passageway lined with broken mirrors. The warped glass reflected the group's haggard faces, their distorted images making them appear monstrous. Mike TV walked ahead, his mother clutching his arm tightly. Charlie and Grandpa Joe stayed close behind, their steps hesitant as they followed Willy Wonka's carefree stride. We're almost there, Wonka said, his voice light and sing-song. The grand finale awaits. The corridor ended at a massive door, its surface etched with intricate patterns of children's faces. The designs were hauntingly lifelike, their hollow eyes staring out at the group. Why are there faces on the door? Charlie asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Wonka didn't turn around. To remember those who came before, he said simply. The door swung open, revealing a room unlike anything they had seen. It was vast and cavernous, its walls lined with jars containing strange, shadowy shapes. A large chair sat at the center of the room, its spiked arms and blood-stained cushions making it look more like a torture device than a throne. This is my legacy, Wonka announced, spreading his arms. The heart of my factory, where dreams come to fruition and justice is served. Mike's mother stepped forward, her voice trembling with fury. Justice, you're insane. You've been killing these children. Wonka's smile widened, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. Not killing, my dear, liberating. You see, each of them was flawed. Greedy, selfish, arrogant. My factory doesn't tolerate imperfection. Mike turned to his mother, his face pale. We have to get out of here, he whispered. Wonka's eyes flicked to the boy and his smile faltered. Leaving isn't an option. Before anyone could react, the floor beneath Mike and his mother gave way. They screamed as they plummeted into the darkness, their cries abruptly silenced by a wet, sickening crunch. Charlie clung to Grandpa Joe, his body trembling. Grandpa, I don't want to be here anymore. Joe pulled him close, his face etched with terror. We're going to get out, Charlie, I promise. Wonka turned to them, his smile softening into something almost sympathetic. Oh, Charlie, don't be afraid. You've made it farther than anyone else. That's something to be proud of. Charlie stared at him, his voice shaking. You're a monster. Wonka's expression darkened. Do you know what made me, Charlie? Do you want to hear the story? He stepped toward them, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. I was a child once like you, but my father was a cruel man. He beat me, starved me, locked me away. He said it was to build character. And you know what, Charlie? It did. He gestured to the room around him. This factory is my masterpiece. Every twist, every trap, every drop of chocolate. It's a reflection of what I learned from him. Pain shapes us. It makes us better. And now, Charlie, it's your turn. Wonka snapped his fingers, and the Oompa-Loompas appeared, their movements sharp and deliberate. No, Grandpa Joe shouted, stepping in front of Charlie. You'll have to go through me first. Wonka's grin returned, cold and predatory. If you insist. The Oompa-Loompas swarmed Joe, dragging him to the spiked chair. He fought valiantly, but their strength overwhelmed him. Charlie, run, Joe shouted, his voice echoing through the room. Charlie turned to flee, but Wonka was faster. He grabbed the boy by the arm, his grip like iron. Now, Wonka said, his tone almost playful. Don't spoil the fun. Joe screamed as the Oompa-Loompas forced him into the chair, the spikes digging into his flesh. A lever was pulled, and the chair snapped shut with a deafening clang. Blood pooled beneath it, seeping into the floor. Charlie froze, his eyes wide with horror. You see, Charlie, Wonka said, turning back to him. Every child must choose to embrace the lessons of the factory, or to perish like the rest. Charlie shook his head, tears streaming down his face. You're insane. I'll never be like you. Wonka's smile vanished. Pity. With a swift motion, he slammed Charlie's head against the armrest of the chair. The sound of bone cracking echoed through the room, and Charlie went limp. Wonka picked up his head before proceeding to do it multiple times. The factory fell silent. Wonka stood over Charlie's lifeless body, his breathing steady. He turned to the Oompa-Loompas. Clean this up now, we have work to do. Hours later, Wonka sat alone in his office, staring at the blood-stained hat on his desk. A knock at the door broke the silence. Enter, he said, his voice calm. The door creaked open, revealing a shadowy figure dressed in black. The man's face was obscured by a mask, resembling a twisted ventriloquist puppet. I've been watching your work, the man said, his voice low and raspy. Impressive, brutal, but methodical. Wonka's lips curled into a faint smile. And who might you be? The figure tilted his head, the mask's empty eyes glinting in the dim light. Let's just say, I appreciate what you do, and I think we can help each other. Wonka leaned back in his chair, his smile widening. I'm listening.